One of my more recent instrument reviews on this channel was a valve trombone, one of the very first I'd looked at on this channel, and today I'm looking at another one quite soon after that. And why is that, you may ask? Because this is a video that I needed to get done before I graduate from Gonzaga University and lose access to its school instruments. That's right, we are dipping into Gonzaga's inventory today, and while the school may not have the most serious or most heavily populated music program, or the one with the most brass instruments in inventory, for whatever the reason may be, Gonzaga's jazz program just so happens to have probably the best valve trombone that money can readily buy. Again, why on earth we would make such a purchase, I truly couldn't say, but here's what I can say. I really enjoy playing it, and I really want to talk about it on the channel. So let's get started. Today we are talking about the King 2166 Legend Series valve trombone. The 2166 is essentially what would happen if you took the famed, venerable, just incredible King 3B trombone, which I have reviewed and spoken very, very highly of on the channel. I happen to own one and don't ever plan on replacing it, but I digress. The 2166 is what happens when you turn a King 3B into a valve trombone. Interesting premise, right? But it makes sense. The 3B is one of the greatest jazz trombone designs of all time, and if you can adapt that legendary bell section onto a slide section and make it play decently, you have, hopefully, a pretty good valve trombone. And I sure think so. I've played a few and none of them outpace the 2166 for me, but we'll get into more detail, of course. As mentioned, the 2166 shares all of its bell geometries and tapers and specifications with the 3B, including the familiar yellow brass 8-inch flare, which we have come to love, but where things do start to differ a little bit is indeed the valve section. Something to keep in mind about trombone design in general: if you have a bell that mounts to both a valve and a slide section for use as a valve trombone and a slide trombone, even if the bell is exactly the same on both, typically you will still find a smaller bore on the valve half of the chassis than the slide half of the chassis, if they are interchangeable. Again, the King enthusiasts in the audience might happen to know that the 3B has a .508 bore at the slide, which places it right in the sweet spot, albeit on the larger end, of jazz trombone bores, which tend to be 485 to 515, maybe 490 to 510 being the ideal, and so 508 fits nicely into that. That being said, the 2166's valve cluster bore is quite a bit smaller at .481, which, King enthusiasts, you might recognize that number once again, because that is the bore size typically associated with at least one leg and sometimes two legs of the King 2B, which is the scaled down, slightly earlier jazz trombone model. It is overall a little bit tighter, smaller bore at the slide, smaller bell taper and flare, but it is one of King's legendary designs. I certainly enjoy the 2B, even if not quite as much as the 3B, but it is interesting that the 3B, or 2166 valve section, shares a bore with the 2B slide section, even though a 2B slide wouldn't fit onto a 3B bell. Other features of note on this instrument include nickel-plated valves. There is also a lyre holder a little further down the lead pipe so that you can have your music on the go, and there is an underslung water key on the end of the bow, which I'm not a huge fan of. I like that trombones are typically designed with sort of a side-slung water key that extends a little bit further so I can actually reach the lever pretty well. An underslung one with a shorter lever is a little bit harder for me to reach. We do also have a nice counterweight to balance the instrument out. But on that note, depending on how you hold the instrument, which I wanted to cover, the counterweight might be a little bit more or less moot. There are a couple ways you can hold the 2166 in my opinion. There is one that I prefer, and there is one that probably a lot more people use. You can hold this instrument in much the same fashion you would a slide trombone, where you've got the pistol grip in the left hand, the thumb goes around the bell brace, and the pointer finger goes a little bit farther over to where the lead pipe is. You can do that. I personally actually prefer to hold it kind of like this, or like this, around the valve block. That just makes it a little bit easier for me, and I feel like I've got more stable control over the instrument. I try not to be a pressure player, especially on low brass where my technique's a little bit iffy, but it does help to have a little bit of stability from the hands, even if it does induce a tiny bit more pressure, and maybe I'm cheating a little bit as compared to having my left hand further back around the bell brace. The 2166 is a supremely easy to play instrument. Now, is it stuffy? Is it resistant? At least more so than the 3B that I love so much? Yeah, I would say so a little bit. I think it's just the nature of a valve trombone, bore size notwithstanding, by the way, to be stuffier than its slide counterpart. Resistance is a little bit of a screwy thing in the brass industry and has to do with a lot more than just how many bends there are in the tubing or how big the bore is at any given point. But nonetheless, the resistance that this instrument provides is a sort of wave that you can kind of coast along if you find the sweet spot. It always takes me a little bit when I pick the instrument up. I'm just not used to playing valve trombone. I don't get the chance to terribly often. But once I do dial in the sweet spot, I can kind of just back off, and the instrument sort of plays itself to a pretty solid extent. The upper register is wide open up to at least a double F. I don't really have anything higher than that. And in fact, by the time I put the mic on the bell, I'd kind of worn out my double F, but it does get up there. It has a really exceptional high C sharp and D, by the way, which are not notes that I usually enjoy playing on any low brass instrument whatsoever, so kudos to the 2166 in that regard. The low register is, of course, a little bit more questionable, as is the intonation throughout the range, but especially down low where you're putting down multiple valves. Some of the chromatic half steps I tested were a little bit more or less than a half step, but the low register spoke fine with a little bit of corralling and chin adjustment. Now, just for kicks and giggles, since I had my 3B-F Silver Sonic in the same room, I got tempted, right? There was the possibility, since the 3B and 2166 parts are compatible, of making a 4-valve valve trombone by way of the 3-valve valve cluster in the right hand and my 3B-F's trigger in the left. And that would, in theory, at least with the trigger extended to E, give me a fully chromatic range and the chance to test it on this instrument. And what I'll say is, this is stupid. There's no reason to be doing this besides, again, kicks and giggles like I did, but it was outstandingly fun. First things first, I do think there is an element of King's older bells truly vibrating a little bit better than their newer ones. I almost honestly preferred the sound and playing experience of attaching my old 3BF Silver Sonic bell to the 2166 valve chassis. I did feel like I was getting a little bit better response and consistency of slots in the low register, and what's more is the bark it got was absolutely unreal, just truly distasteful and hilarious. And that is about as much as I bothered to do with my 3BF Silver Sonic bell on the 2166 valves, because there's really no point in trying to review two different instruments combined into one. But it really was just a fun experiment in A, testing the in-between notes between the low and pedal register, and B, seeing how an old Silver Sonic bell would respond to that valve cluster, which is to say very well. Now, anytime the subject of the valve trombone is broached, there is somebody partaking in the conversation who questions its merit or existence in the brass family. Oh, the valve trombone's a cheater instrument. The only reason you play on it is because you're too lazy to learn the slide. I'm going to vehemently disagree with that and give you some examples of where I think this instrument really shines. It is a unique instrument with a unique role that, sure, can actually blend decently in terms of sound with the 3B and other jazz trombones, although we'll talk about tone more specifically a little bit later, but it really does have its own distinct uses. For instance, last year in Gonzaga's jazz program, as part of our spring fusion project, as we always do every year, we were playing some Snarky Puppy tunes, and that is a band that typically only involves a couple trumpets and tenor saxes, usually not any trombones whatsoever, and we have a nice multifaceted trombone section at the school. One of them plays piano, one of them plays tuba, another one of them plays hand percussion, but I was lead trombone in the band that semester, and I kind of wanted to play trombone. I didn't want to go bang on the bongos for that tune, so I took a melody part, and I tried to learn it, and it was really tough, this particular tune, and so I got out the valve trombone and started doing it on that. And in terms of sound, in terms of blend with the trumpets and the saxes, and in terms of general facility through some of the crazier lines, it really made a lot more sense. And it sounded something like this. So of course this is a jazz fusion bebop oriented instrument, and it's good for either lines that need to blend with valved instruments or solos that are allowed to stick out of the texture. It's obviously no substitute for a real trombone, just because you have things on trombone like equal fluidity between all of the notes, since it's all on one open slide and it doesn't involve valves being pressed or extra bends of tubing being induced. And of course, the more obvious thing is you can't do glissandos to the same extent on a valve trombone as the way you can on a slide trombone, but in certain uses it really does have its merits. And of course, the other thing that typically comes up when talking about the valve trombone is its other biggest cultural use, which is that in Latin and mariachi and banda music. Now, I don't happen to know basically any of that off the top of my head, unfortunately, and I guess I was a little bit rushed making this video. So instead, I did the very extra thing of taking a Latin-style tune that I actually wrote for kind of a New Orleans-style brass band and condensing that down into a trombone section and multi-tracking it with the 2166 playing the melody. Anyway, here's what that sounds like. And I think that is a good illustration of how this instrument's tone stacks up to that of a 3B slide trombone. They actually can be very similar with certain approaches and at certain dynamics. Of course, different things start to happen when you play fast runs on the two, or if you push the 2166 to a certain point, yeah, it starts to sound a little bit more brittle than a typical 3B would, and so I prefer to play it as laid back as possible in most cases. But actually, it's not a hopeless endeavor to try and get the 2166 to blend with 3B-like slide trombones. What's more, with the already captivating tone of the 2166 is that the provided King 7C in the case of this one really does seem to do well at garnering the full tonal range, maybe to a greater extent than such a mouthpiece would on my 3BF. I do use a C cup, namely a 6 3/4 C, which is for some reason a tiny bit deeper than the 7C for a lot of my lead and jazz work on the 3BF, but if I'm looking for more of a ballad sound, typically I don't like to use a C cup, whereas the 2166 does genuinely seem to respond the best with that C cup sort of mouthpiece. Now, whether you would get a King 7C with any 2166 valve trombone is not certain. Some sources say that it's supplied with a King 12C mouthpiece, and some say that it's supplied with a Bach 7C mouthpiece, which would honestly make sense since the Conn-Selmer umbrella now contains Conn, King, and Bach, so, all of the above are probably supplied with Bach mouthpieces in general, just because Conn and King mouthpieces of the era of, let's say, 30 years ago to now are essentially just Bach copies. But whether it's a King or a Bach 7C, I think the 7C is a really great mouthpiece to make this instrument respond well. I have briefly tried a couple of other mouthpieces on it. When I first picked up the 2166 to learn that Snarky Puppy tune on, I plugged into it what was, and to some extent still is, my ultimate small shank low brass mouthpiece, which is an old Bach Corporation 9 that has really made a couple of old baritones and valve trombones speak way better than any other mouthpiece I've tried plugging into any of the above. It really is a superb mouthpiece, but when I plugged it into the 2166, I was having a rather stuffy playing experience, and eventually, especially with some of the Snarky Puppy part being fairly high, I decided to stick in the 7C, and immediately things cleared up. I don't know what it is about the valve trombone, or specifically the modern valve trombone, I would say, but it really does prefer the cutting edge of the C cup, even when you do relax and play really softly and play quietly, and you can get that sort of darkness that you would expect out of something like the no-letter cup, like the 9, but it is a little bit of a different experience, and the instrument definitely prefers the blow of the C cup, I will say. I did try just a standard Bach Corporation 6.5 AL on this instrument briefly at the end of my testing session just to see what would happen. That is quite a lot larger, deeper, and more funnel-shaped in terms of the cup geometry, as well as a larger throat and backbore. And it did fine. You know, I played something a little bit more ballad-oriented on it. I would say that, again, the C-cup mouthpiece just provides the optimal response here. So I hope you like playing on C-cups if you do choose to play the 2166. But quirks aside, the King 2166 Legend Valve Trombone has been my favorite by a country mile of the ones that I've played thus far. Again, the Getson that I reviewed recently is, objectively speaking, a good instrument, and if you find one, it might be worth picking up if you're into valve trombones. But it, first of all, wasn't fun to hold, and second of all, it was just lacking some sort of magic in the playing experience that the 2166 frankly has more of and really captivates me with. Am I biased because I play on a King 3B and I enjoy it so much? Yeah, I am biased. When I pick up the 2166, it is familiar to me and I am naturally inclined to like it as someone who is a real 3B loyalist. But I really do stand by my statement that any sort of King 3B equivalent valve trombone is just about the best in the valve trombone industry, which is a pretty niche industry, of course. There are, of course, other good ones like the Con 5G or the Bach V16 that are probably just about up on par with the 2166. I will make the slight caveat that, I said it's supposedly the best valve trombone money can buy. If money can find and buy you a King valve trombone that has a silver sonic bell or a King 2B valve trombone, those have the possibility of being a little bit better, maybe, than the modern 2166. I think King's older sterling silver bells really just vibrate a special way. There is truly so much resonance and projection and truly gorgeous tone at all dynamics coming off of the old sterling silver bell. So if you can find a silver sonic valve trombone, which I don't know if those are a thing, or maybe find a silver sonic bell to pair with the valve trombone, that might improve your 2166 experience. Whereas the 2B thing, that's up for debate. There is some amount of school of thought to say that kind of the smaller a valve trombone is, the better it will respond. The valve trombone is, again, a pretty separate instrument from the standard slide trombone, in a similar way that the alto trombone is a separate instrument from the tenor trombone. They do require slightly different approaches, different mouthpieces, and different specs in construction, so some people might make the argument that the 3B bell section is a little bit too open for something like a valve trombone, whereas the smaller, tighter 2B bell is better suited for it. I think you'd get kind of a 50-50 on either side. Some people would claim that a 2B bell is too tight and would make the instrument feel too stuffy and therefore like the 3B bell more on a valve trombone, whereas some people would say to optimize the valve trombone experience, you want the smallest, tightest bell possible. Again, like I said, resistance is a finicky thing in the brass industry, and so there is really no one clear answer to, oh, you want a bigger bell here and a smaller bell here on this or that valve trombone, but you might find that you enjoy a 2B valve trombone more than a 3B valve trombone. I haven't gotten to try a 2B valve trombone, so at the moment, I'm rocking the 2166 right up at the top of my valve trombone list. And with that, I finally feel like I've gotten all my thoughts out about the King 2166, and we'll start to put a bow on this video. Thank you so much if you stuck around to this point. I am sure that Editor Sam will find out that this is quite a long video once he gets to the editing room, but I had a lot of fun making this video for you, and I hope you had a lot of fun watching. Until next time, you can always find more instrument reviews in the top right corner in the card, and we'll see you, on that note, on the flip side. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support the creation of bigger and better content on the Samuel Plays Brass channel, have your name featured right here, and a whole host of other perks and benefits, then please consider pledging your support at patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass. For now, you can find more videos in the end screen cards to my left.